Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we are diving into the evolving world of e-bike laws, and specifically what you as a listener need to know about how these laws are changing across the US. We've been looking at a ton of sources, really from like state and local guidelines to, potential federal proposals, long-term trends even, to try and break down what's important right now and what might be coming down the pike.
Yeah, and I think what's really fascinating is that in 2025, we're seeing the action really happening at those state and local levels since federal action is kind of on hold at the moment.
Right.
So places like California and Oregon are kind of leading the charge here. They're rolling out some pretty strict new rules, particularly around throttle use. And one thing that stands out is the emphasis on battery safety. Like regardless of whether you're an avid e-bike rider, thinking about buying one or just keeping an eye on the trends, that battery safety piece is really something to pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure. And just as a reminder for everyone listening, the whole three-class system for e-bikes is super important for understanding all these regulations.
Absolutely.
Right, so just to recap, Class 1, that's your pedal assist up to 20-mile rear. Class 2 throws a throttle into the mix at that same speed. And then Class 3 is pedal assist but goes up to 28-mile rear.
Right. And, that three-class system is what so many states have adopted now,
Yeah.
including, the federal government's existing definition.
Yeah. So with California, for example,
Yeah.
some of the big changes this year,
Yeah.
2025,
Right.
are that both Class 1 and Class 3 are now pedal assist only.
Exactly. If you're someone who likes that throttle
Yeah.
on those classes, that's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're keeping that throttle for the Class 2 e-bikes up to 20-mile rear.
Yeah, exactly.
But they also have a 750-watt continuous motor power limit now for all the classes.
Yeah. And just thinking about the wattages, that often aligns with the definition of like low-speed electric bicycles, which can impact how they're viewed from a regulatory standpoint.
Got it. And, California really seems to be putting a strong focus on safety in general.
Absolutely.
So, now helmets are mandatory for anyone under 18.
Right.
And for all Class 3 riders, no matter your age. And they've also tightened restrictions on where those Class 3 e-bikes can be used on bike paths. They're basically limiting them to
Right.
paths that run alongside a road. And you have to be 16 or older to ride a Class 3 in the first place.
And then on the battery side, it's really interesting. All e-bike batteries sold in California as of, I believe, the beginning of 2026
Yeah.
have to be tested and certified by these accredited labs, independent labs that are meeting those testing standards.
Right.
And manufacturers, they need to get on board with this year. So that could really drive safer battery production, potentially nationwide, even without a federal mandate.
Yeah, and Oregon, as we mentioned, is kind of on a similar track as California this year.
Yeah, for sure.
So they're also getting rid of throttles on Class 3 e-bikes, same 750-watt motor power limit, and helmets are required for riders 16 and under. So again, very much in line with some of those California rules. It shows you that a lot of states are, grappling with similar concerns, but coming at it with their own, subtle differences in how they implement things.
Right. And it's interesting. You see that kind of across the board. So Alaska, for example, they don't have any age restrictions on e-bikes, but they do prohibit Class 2 and 3 e-bikes on trails and paths. And their helmet law is a universal one, applies to everybody. You've got other states like Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, New York, Texas, where the focus has been on helmet use for younger riders and also putting some limits on where those Class 3 e-bikes can be used on paths. So again, some common themes, but the specifics really vary from state to state.
And then even zooming in closer,
Right.
even within a state, you can see variations at the county or city level.
Yeah.
So for example, in California, Orange County, they're really cracking down on those e-bike rules because of accident concerns. They're aligning with that state 750-watt limit. And Cypress in Orange County is actually banning Class 2 and 3 e-bikes on sidewalks.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to see how local areas are responding to these very specific safety issues.
Yeah, for sure. And then you have proposals like New York City's Priscilla's Law,
Right.
which would require e-scooter and e-bike registration and even license plates.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives you a sense of where things might be headed.
Right. More accountability.
Yeah,
That's in those urban environments. All right. So looking ahead a bit, to the midterm, let's say 2026 to 2029.
Right.
We're starting to see some potential for federal involvement. So there's this e-bike act, and this is interesting because it proposes a tax credit.
Yeah, federal tax credit.
Right, which
Cool.
would make e-bikes more affordable for people.
Yeah.
It's capped at a bike cost of $8,000, and The motor can't be over 750 watts to
Mhm.
qualify. And then you've got the E-Bike Share Act, which is kind of cool. It's all about accessibility. So it would provide grants for e-bike sharing programs in disadvantaged communities. But here's the thing. It only applies to class 1 and 2 e-bikes.
Interesting. So you're seeing a little bit of a fragmented approach at the federal level right now,
Yeah.
which raises some questions about how things will shake out in the long term.
Absolutely. And then, the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, they're actually actively looking into developing new safety rules for e-bikes. But what's interesting is that they're focusing specifically on mechanical hazards. That's kind of separate from all the attention that battery safety has been getting.
Right. So this could be a move towards like more holistic safety standards, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Addressing all aspects.
So what kind of trends do you think we might see at the state level over the next few years?
Well, I think we can probably expect more states to jump on that three-class system bandwagon
Okay.
just because it provides clarity. We might also see, potentially more age restrictions, particularly when it comes to Class 3 e-bikes, and maybe even a wider adoption of helmet mandates.
Hmm.
And registration and licensing, yeah, that's something that's pretty rare right now.
Right.
But it could be revisited in some areas. And then I think the rules around like path and trail access,
Yeah.
that's an area where we'll probably see more standardization at the state level just to reduce confusion.
Right, right. All right, so let's zoom out even further. Let's talk long term, beyond 2029. What are we looking at in terms of potential changes and challenges?
Well, I think the continued growth in e-bike use is going to drive a need for even clearer and more standardized regulations across the board,
Yeah, for sure.
at all levels, really. And then we can't forget about technological advancements. We're talking, faster speeds, smarter bikes,
Right.
maybe even a Class 4 e-bike down the line. And all of that's going to force policymakers to adapt.
Right. I think it's really interesting to consider how all these rules might eventually align with other forms of micromobility, too.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you categorize these?
Exactly, exactly. What about environmental concerns? Do you think those will continue to influence regulations? Oh, absolutely. I think we'll see a continued push for incentives to promote e-bike use and a bigger focus on battery recycling,
Right.
as those batteries reach the end of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. What about expert opinions? I mean, are there any kind of differing viewpoints out there about the direction of these e-bike laws?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of support for e-bikes in general, but there are some differing views on just how much regulation is the right amount.
Right.
Balancing safety with making sure you don't stifle innovation and adoption. And, we've seen some concerns about, injuries related to e-bikes. So that could push for stricter safety measures in the future.
And, I think it's also worth noting, what's happening in Europe. They tend to have lower speed limits for those basic e-bikes, and the rules get a lot stricter when you get into those higher speed models. There's even been some talk about insurance requirements.
In some European countries, they also have some lower power limits compared to the US, and the UK has even banned those high power conversion kits.
Hmm.
But then they also have some pretty enticing incentives to get people using e-bikes.
Right, right. So maybe there are some best practices we can learn from over there.
Exactly.
So to wrap things up, it seems like e-bike laws are in this really dynamic phase right now. We've got all these immediate changes at the state and local levels that are really focused on safety. And then, in the longer term, we're looking at potential federal involvement
Right.
and adaptations driven by both technology and just the sheer popularity of e-bikes.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating is like all these different layers of regulation, right?
Mm.
How they're going to interact and evolve as the technology keeps developing
Mhm.
and e-bikes become even more commonplace.
So I guess my final question is for you, the listener. What do you think is the biggest challenge for both e-bike riders and policymakers in creating this clear, safe environment for everybody? How do we balance encouraging innovation, ensuring e-bikes are accessible to everyone, while still making safety a top priority on the roads and paths? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive today, and we'll see you next time.